Hello and welcome to Media Chats, a platform where media professionals and experts to delve into trending topics and share industry insights. I'm your host, Xu Yawen. Chinese President Xi Jinping has embarked on a state visit to Russia, scheduled between Wednesday and Saturday. This visit coincides with Russia's Victory Day celebrations on May 9th, marking the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, which brought an end to the Second World War in Europe. This year also marks the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of resistance against the Japanese aggression. Its conclusion means that the global fight in the World Anti-Fascist War reached complete victory. How will President Xi's visit to Russia further deepen bilateral relations? Why are stable China-Russia relations crucial for regional and global stability? Will the world learn from the lessons of 80 years ago to preserve peace, or are we heading toward a more turbulent future? For more, we're joined by Mr. Chen Weihua, EU Bureau Chief of China Daily, Eugen Pavlov, journalist with Sputnik News in Beijing, and Angelo Giuliano, a Swiss-Italian political analyst based in Hong Kong. So, Mr. Chen, let me come to you first. We know President Xi Jinping's state visit to Russia comes at the time of frequent high-level interactions between the two leaders in recent years. And this is President Xi's 11th visit to Russia since 2013, and the two leaders have met more than 40 times at different occasions in recent years. So, what do you make of the timing and the significance of this trip? What signal does China hope to send to the world through this visit?
First of all, thank you very much, Yavin, for having me on this program. I think, your question actually answered very well. The number of visits, she has paid to Russia and the number of times the two leaders have met over the years. I mean, we all know that the leaders' meetings are very important and crucial for bilateral tie. And this is a very, important time, the 80th anniversary, what Russia called the Great Patriotic War. I think China and Russia and then the Soviet Union obviously make the biggest sacrifice, and we all sort of China and Russia, the permanent five member of the UN Security Council. We are important powers, we want to sustain the global order after the World War II. I mean, but now, I mean, it's a time of international order with the United Nations and international rules have been challenged. If we look at a country like the U.S., want to wage a Cold War. I mean, even sort of a small country, especially in this world, being not respected. And so I think there was the trade war, tariff war, all these sort of trying to divide the world into political blocs. These are all challenges to the global orders that being established since the World War II. So I think this is very important. I mean, obviously, I mean, China and Russia are two large neighbors sharing a very long border. I mean, so stable relationship means not just great deal for the two countries. I think for the whole world, and the rest of the world is looking at this.
Eugene, from Russia's perspective, so how are Russian media covering President Xi Jinping's state visits? And based on your observation, what key points are highlighted in their reports?
So as far as I noticed, the majority of major Russian news outlets, media companies, TV channels, they have covered to some extent President Xi's visit to Moscow. I wouldn't say that there are many points that are emphasized. The very fact that a Chinese leader is coming to Moscow is, of course, of great importance and symbolic importance. It's been reiterated by many that it is also not just about the participation in the 9th of May parade on the Red Square, which is a very important deal, but also that some opinion pieces speculated on what the two leaders might discuss during this visit of President Xi to Moscow, because obviously there are many things to talk about, both in bilateral relations and the current geopolitical situation in the world.
Angelo, what's your take on Eugen and Mr. Chen's remarks, and how do you think President Xi Jinping's state visit to Russia will further deepen the two countries' no-limits strategic partnership?
Well, I think it's highly symbolic. First of all, it is about celebrating the defeat over Nazism. And I think especially when we are actually facing, I would say, revisionists from the West, which are actually trying to portray the US as being the savior, the one that actually defeated Nazi Germany. I think it's important just for both Russia and China just to go back to really what happened during the World War II. We are actually living this transition called the Thucydides trap. We have emerging power, you have declining power, and we have here, luckily, two countries, two leaders in the person of Xi Jinping and President Putin that are extremely pragmatic, and they want to go towards the multipolar world, which is a non-alignment, which is about also no ideology, and live and let live. Look for what unites us and set aside the differences. And I think they embody the new world towards where we're going to, where every single country would have its own voice, and the Western hegemony will be just I would say a dark side of our human history.
Mr. Chen, China and Russia's partnership now covers many areas. For instance, in trade and economic ties, their bilateral trade reached a record high of nearly $250 billion last year, marking an increase of 2%. In the meantime, China has been Russia's largest trading partner for 13 consecutive years, and Russia remains the major energy supplier to China. More than 95% of their trade is now settled in local currencies. So how do you assess the two countries' economic cooperation after, hearing those numbers, and what new areas of growth are likely to emerge?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, the numbers, because I always remember years ago, the leaders talk about how to boost the bilateral trade to like a 20 billion. I mean, I remember in 2002, it's only like 12 billion. I mean, the numbers you just said, it's approaching 250 billion. It's has grown by leaps and bounds. Obviously, I mean, China and Russia, I mean, the two large countries have great potential. I think it's not fully tapped, I still believe. China obviously is not the China 30 years ago. I mean, actually, if you look at 1990, I mean, Russia economy was actually bigger than China's. And so China grew enormously. I mean, not just in size. China has also grown technologically, become a major technology powerhouse. So I think Russia obviously is still technology powerhouse too. I mean, it's, if you look at the space and other, I mean, Russia obviously it's the largest country on the planet. And so I think there is so much complementary. I mean, from my perspective, Chinese investors are really looking at opportunities in Russia in every sectors. Given Russia has a unique advantage that many other countries don't really have. I mean, if you look at even the Far East, the Russia Far East, I mean, it's a huge area to be explored. I mean, for bilateral cooperation. I mean, the manufacturing. I mean, the supply chain. I mean, China is the biggest manufacturing powerhouse in the world. Russia could be integrated into this supply chain. There is so much to do. I mean, obviously, what we're seeing is the phenomenal progress of Russia natural gas pipeline, energy supply to China. I mean, that's very important for China. I mean, so all these are very complementary. I look at the space exploration. I mean, we heard many news every few weeks about China's progress in this regard. I mean, so I think China obviously can learn still a lot from Russia in that regard. So overall, I'm quite optimistic. I'm very pleased about the progress in the last decades, and I think we can have greater potential in the years, decades ahead.
Eugene, so Mr. Chen, he just talked about the economic prospect of the two countries' bilateral relations. If we look at the cultural exchanges and people-friendly measures, we could see that the two countries have placed a growing emphasis on this sector. For instance, like they have held each other's national years to promote cultural understanding through like tourism, media exchanges, and they have also actively supported youth exchanges programs to ensure that future generation can better understand with each other's values. So could you share with us some examples in those fields and how these initiatives and efforts bring people of the two countries closer?
Thank you for the question. I think that both governments understand very well that good relations between the two countries, the key to that is good people-to-people relations. And there's been a lot of emphasis on cultural and humanitarian exchanges, educational. The thing here is that, in my opinion, it is like long-term investment. So sometimes the fruits, you'll see the fruits of that in maybe even a generation. So on one hand, we already in the last decades, we've seen that the ties between the two countries, the relationships between the two people, they're definitely improving. China has become much more recognizable in Russia. Being a foreign journalist in China, I see that a lot of people know many things about Russia, and when they hear where I come from, the reactions are usually very positive. So I think there's been a lot of progress on that part. And we have a very long history, and for the most part of this history, our relations have been very good. As far as the example, so I think that very small things can make a huge difference. And one of these examples of these cultural ties that I can think of now is that a couple of years ago in Moscow, I attended a concert, and then I interviewed this young Chinese lady who participated in that concert. And then she told me a story as I interviewed her. And she told me that she had no connection with Russia whatsoever. And she studied classical music back in China. But her teacher, she once studied back in the Soviet Union in Moscow. And so she told this young student of hers that, you know, in your class of instrument, Russia is the best place to go. They have great tradition, great school, so you have to go there. And the girl, that she had absolutely no idea what Russia is like. So at some point she applied, she packed her bags, went to Moscow. So when I met her, she already spoke very good Russian. She studied at Moscow Conservatory, the famous musical school. And she taught there also, so she had some students. So this is the way how that lady that studied in the Soviet Union many decades ago influenced this particular person. She came to Russia as a result of that, and obviously she to make a huge impact herself. I'm pretty sure about that, because the students will remember her, the people she works with will remember her. And so I think that these very human things, these tiny details, they can make a huge difference. Just as with these cinema festivals, you never know, maybe you have a Chinese boy or a Russian boy or a girl who watch a movie made in this other country, and this makes a huge impression on them, and maybe in 20-30 years they become a film director. And this person will improve these ties immensely. So you never know. So it's a long-term investment and huge opportunities in here.
Yeah, speaking of that, actually, Mr. Chen, like for me, I know some senior people, they either had studied in Russia or spoke Russian, the language, and also like growing up in our generation, we read literature like books that's written by Russian writer. Like, is that something that how our two countries' history in the form of music, art, literature carry forward, right? What's your like thought on that?
Spasiba, Eugen. I mean, obviously, it's very interesting. You know, you mentioned that actually people my age, you know, when I was in junior high school, you know, actually there was a class. I mean, our sister class, all studying Russians. That's why I learned a little bit. Actually, one of my best friends there later went to Moscow to study mathematics, I think for like 15 years. He is now back at East China Normal University in Shanghai as a professor, I mean, for I mean, very good one. So, I mean, we all know, I mean, from studying science in school, I mean, there was so many Russian scientists. I mean, if you look, study chemistry, others. So I think people obviously respect a great deal of Russian. You talk about the ballet, you talk about the music, art, science. So I think this is a border, which had a huge impact on human progress. So we should be thankful for those Russian civilization, Chinese civilization, I mean, Indian civilization, European civilization. We should respect each other. What I want to mention, very important, I think that's China. I mean, since I'm here in Europe, I think China could play a very important role actually in bridging. I mean, today it's a very complicated geopolitics, helping bridging the gap between Russia and Europe, which I think they should become good neighbors. I mean, like China and Russia, I think good neighbors is essential. I mean, it's very important to everyone, not just China, Russia.
Angelo, so the key principle, if we look at China-Russia bilateral ties, the key principle of the two countries is mutually beneficial, non-alliance, non-confrontation, and does not target any third party. So how do you view the trend of this everlasting friendship between China and Russia? And also, what positive effect does it have in terms of major power relations around the world?
Well, it's just the fact that it's a completely new, different approach. It is about the carrot strategy as opposed to the stick strategy. When you look at how Trump is treating even its allies, it is about the stick. It's about threatening. Now here, what Russia and China are doing, it's a strategy of engagement. Let's see what we can do together. What are our common points? Where can we grow together? When you do that, you actually build up this engagement and you have more leverage and you actually avoid confrontation because you start to have mutual benefits, mutual interests, and a better future this way. When you look also at the complementary, it's very pragmatic too. Let's not forget that Russia needs as much as China needs Russia. They have a future that is tied together. And at the same time, you see there's a growth of trade, there's a growth of cultural exchanges, and they are putting together this actually strategy through BRICS, this strategy of multipolar world. Now the world has changed. You have major countries that need to have a say in this equation. I'm talking about Brazil, I'm talking about India, and the whole global south. So what is inspiring here is that both Russia and China are leading the way by example. And it's not about talking, it's about doing. Not much talk. It's all about action, investment, infrastructure, trade. Those actions speak much more than empty words when we look at from the West. They're talking about alliances. It is not going to be like this with China and Russia. Those are extremely, we are talking about the next decades, the next centuries. They are shaping the future of this multipolar world.
Mr. Chen, I want to come to you to discuss 80 years after the World War II. We know this year marks the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Chinese People's War of resistance against the Japanese aggression. And during the Second World War, China fought against Japan for 14 years. That was from 1931 to 1945. And by doing so, it prevented Japan from coordinating avoiding a two-front war for the Soviet Union. So could you elaborate on how significant is China's role in the Eastern Front of the Second World War? And why is that so important? Why is China's fighting against the Japanese aggression so important to the overall victory of the World Anti-Fascist War?
Definitely. I mean, we all know there was the Nazi Germany, imperialist Japan was threatening the world, I mean, in those years. And so it's especially important to mark this 80th anniversary because, we are seeing the Western world trying to rewrite history. I'm here in Europe again, so I remember when they marked the anniversary of the Auschwitz. I mean, Poland. He didn't invite Russia to attend. It's obviously the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz. It's not the United States or a British. So I think we should respect the history. At the same time, I think you are right. I mean, the role played by Russia or then the Soviet Union, or China especially, are not very well known or deliberately distorted today by the Western politician or media. Not many people know in the West that the Chinese people actually make the most sacrifice during the Second World War. I mean, we lost 30 like million people, so it was a brutal Japanese aggression against China. I mean, just look at the Nanjing massacre. That's the darkest episode in human history, I would say. So, and the China, of course, because of the Chinese people's resistance, and so the Japanese Imperial Army could not become a much more threat. They are aligning obviously with Nazi Germany to threaten the Soviet Union in those years or other countries. We always mark the like flying tigers, the American army is helping China. But we should also remember actually the Soviet Union at the very beginning also provided military aid, army, all those assistance to fight against the Japanese. So obviously, I think the Chinese, I mean, it's a huge country. It's being the Japanese army also suffered, the ultimate defeat, obviously, surrendered. And it's the joint effort, I mean, mostly by the Chinese people's brave resistance. The war against the fascists in those years was joined by the then Soviet Union, the US. Just remember, we were allies against the Nazi Germany and the Japanese imperial fascists. So that's a really important moment to remind the world that's history and should not be rewritten.
Very well said. We have to be cautious about, there's the rising trend of whitewash. Eugene, we know China and Russia, back then it was Soviet Union at the time, were the main battlefields in Asia and Europe during the Second World War. And the people of both countries were the backbone forces in the fight against the fascism and militarism, as Mr. Chen just mentioned, and making tremendous sacrifices and historic contributions to securing victory. How do you assess Soviet Union's critical role in the anti-fascist war? And how did, the Soviet Union's support for China back then during the wartime help build this strong friendship that still shapes our two countries' bilateral relations today?
Thank you for the question. So first, on the first part of your question, obviously the Soviet Union carried the brunt of the fighting in Europe, and it's quite preposterous when Donald Trump is saying something like America was like this, basically the only country that had the victory for everybody. Obviously, it's not true. What the Soviet Union faced was essentially a united Europe effort at that moment, because it was not just the Nazi Germany, it was the industries of basically the whole continent. It was many, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of recruits from different countries. So again, apart from Germany, Hungary, Romania, Finland was an ally, Bulgaria even, that was once liberated by the Russians from the Ottoman Empire, but they took the side of the Nazis in that part. Obviously, Italy, Spain sent a lot of volunteers. So it was a huge conflict involving many European countries, not just Germany versus the Soviet Union. And the Germans and their allies in Europe, they suffered about 80% of their total casualties on the Eastern Front, fighting the Soviet Union. So that is about the contribution. Of course, the Soviet Union made a huge sacrifice in terms of manpower and national wealth loss. The current numbers stand about 25 to 28 million people that were lost in that conflict. Practically every person in Russia today and in many other post-Soviet countries, they have somebody in their family who were a casualty in that conflict. And also, as far as the second part of your question is concerned, obviously, the Soviet Union, it had its own conflicts with Japan in the 1930s. The fact that China was resisting Japan so boldly helped at some point in 1941 to the Soviet Union to send some reinforcements from the Russian Far East to the aid of Moscow, which was, of course, a very decisive moment. And the Soviet troops provided a lot of support to China in the 1930s before the war started in the Soviet Union. So Mr. Chen here, he mentioned the Soviet contribution and the Tigers, the American pilots, but there were also the Soviet pilots who fought in 1937 to 1940, and they were the key. The Americans back then, they didn't provide any major support to China. And it was mostly the Soviet pilots who denied this Japanese advantage in the skies. And the contribution, the biggest battle was the Battle of Wuhan. They actually started fighting the Japanese in the Battle of Nanking. And even in 1938, there was this daring mission when the Soviet pilots, they bombed the Japanese occupied Taiwan, which was just a crazy mission. It was almost impossible to get there, but still somehow managed to do that. And yeah, so the battles of Wuhan, the Battle of Chongqing, yes, it was overall about 2,000 Soviet personnel that participated in that. I just yesterday attended a memorial service where the ambassadors of the former Soviet republics and the local Chinese government paid tribute to the fallen soldiers of the Soviet and Mongol military who fought for liberation of Janbei at Janjiako. And it's very good to see how China cherishes this memory of the Soviet soldiers, because as Mr. Chen started, there is a lot of revisionism and history rewriting in the world. And in Europe, we've seen for over a decade, for many, many years, this rewriting of history, whitewashing Nazism, intertwining this neoliberal, EU ideology, anti-Sovietism. So the Nazis were actually the good guys, the people who collaborated with the Nazis. They were fighting for freedom against the Soviet occupation and all that. And we see the monuments to the Soviet soldiers in countries like the Baltic states, in Poland, in Czech Republic, they're being demolished. And now you see a village and there is a monument with the names of people from that very same village that fought in the Red Army against the Nazis, and their offspring, they destroyed this monument. So it's really quite remarkable and difficult to comprehend. But thank you for the people of China for preserving this memory. We're very grateful for that.
And Mr. Chen, speaking of European countries, we know they played an active role in rebuilding the post-war international order, such as through key conferences like Yalta and Potsdam. They were held in Europe and laid the foundation for the United Nations and the post-war global system. So also we know this year marks the 80th anniversary of the UN's founding. Then how do you see the challenges and growing dysfunction that the organization is facing? And how can we help to, address those challenges to keep multilateralism alive and working in today's world?
The global order with the UN as the core, the center, I think obviously being challenged. I mean, if we look at just the trade war, tariff war waged by the US, and it's also because the World Trade Organization is rendered dysfunctional simply because the US, since the first Trump administration, has refused to, appoint new judges to the appellation body. And the Biden administration obviously didn't reverse that trend. And so the WTO is dysfunctional. Even you can still, obviously, China has, even, Europeans have also filed, the Canadians, they have filed the cases, but it's not going to be binding, without this jury. So that's just the one very example of today's world. Obviously, we have this United States, which always claims to be the leader of the world, which is quitting one international, UN organization, WHO, UNESCO, after the other. So it's just dismantling the global system and the organizations. And pouring out the fund. I was in Geneva actually just 2 months ago, I believe, for the UN Human Rights Council, because of the pouring out of the US funding. They couldn't even give me a proper press card. They just printed on the A4 sheet paper. They say, because we have to cut budget because of the US withdrawing the money. So that's just one very life like a case in today's world. It's also important because it's also the year marking the 50th anniversary of China-EU relation. So I think EU EU still is not with the US, given that the EU's foreign policies has long been dictated by US, but EU is not with the US on this dismantling the international organization. I think EU is also for multilateralism. So I think we should all join forces in this very difficult time of human history, because it's really a turning point. Without this international law-based system with UN at the center, we are going to enter a very dangerous world, for the decades to come.
So, Eugene, how can closer coordination between China and Russia, like through platforms of like the United Nations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also the BRICS, contribute to promoting a multipolar world and inclusive economic growth, both regionally and globally?
Thank you for the question. So I totally agree with what Mr. Chen said about this. And I think that both Russia and China are interested in maintaining the UN-based order, which has been reiterated multiple times by both the Russian and the Chinese speakers. Why is that? Because the United Nations, in theory, are exactly meant to reflect that multilateralism and multipolarity if implemented properly. However, it is very hard to maintain such a structure when you have a key actor like the United States, for example, showing lack of interest in continuing to participate in such an organization. So I think that what Russia and China do, they really want to have UN still running, to have its role. This participation in other organizations that you mentioned, BRICS, SCO, it is complementary. It's not meant to subvert the United Nations, but these are also markers of the emerging multipolarity, where you have multiple different formats where countries free of some centralized agenda can discuss regional issues, the global developmental issues. So I think that the very existence of such new formats, it already shows both the efforts and the changing reality of the international system.
Angelo, so Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed this global security initiative 3 years ago, advocating for a collaborative approach to security rather than the zero-sum game where one nation's security comes at the cost of another. So how do you understand this initiative, and in what ways might they complement or strengthen existing international efforts to uphold, UN-centered multipolar world order?
Well, as Eugene just said before, the problem is that the West, I would call it the collective West, because you have the US and you have a lot of vassal states in the EU, and I would say Japan, Australia, and South Korea are all also following the US agenda. Why is it so? Why do we have those structures? It's very simple. First of all, I would say that there's a decredibilization of those international agencies because of the US, why they've been using them, and also their veto power. Their veto power has been it's been extremely abusive. When you look at all the decisions of the majority of UN countries against the genocide in Israel, well, it's a decriminalization. When you are talking about international order and you actually breach everything whenever it doesn't go into the direction you want it to go, so there's a decriminalization, and this is in the aspect of those international organizations. I'm talking about the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, because those institutions are completely controlled by a few, and they are extremely undemocratic. Now, why we have BRICS, why we have those parallel institutions, is because a lot of countries are not being treated fairly by those international institutions, including, and also I would say, as Eugene said, it's not about replacing. It is about when you don't find a solution through the UN, you need to find other bodies, alternative, to start a new rules.
Mr. Chen, so as we have noticing this growing challenges to multilateralism, how is China demonstrating its commitment through frameworks like the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence and the Global Security Initiative? Could you share with us some examples as well?
Yeah, I think it's very important that you mentioned this 5 principles, which actually was the first put forward in the 1950s. It was like 10 years, more than 10 years before I was born. So, but I think it's very relevant, even today. Especially, I would say, I mean, when you also mention this global security initiative, I think because China firmly believe, I mean, I think these principles have been now widely recognized, respected by the international community, I mean, especially in the global south, because China believe that a country is large and small should be equal. I think China never attached, China, for example, had the famous Belt Road Initiative. China never sort of impose conditions that would infringe others' sovereignty. Internal China's foreign policy is based on these 5 principles, and China is well known for non-interference in others' domestic affairs. We're not, again, it's like a G7, others like ganging up on against other, with this mindset of a zero-sum game. China firmly believes this win-win mindset. If you look at this trade war, tariff war, it's all zero-sum. It's a lose-lose game. No one wins. I mean, everyone is going to be worse off, period. And so China believes even you win bigger than it's still good. I mean, it's okay. But, it's a win-win game. Last, I want to just briefly mention, because China always believe, I mean, countries with differences. For example, China, the European. I mean, I just want to mention, because this is the 50th anniversary of China EU relation. I mean, we're not identical with Russia. I mean, we have agreements on many issues, but we are not agreeing 100% on everything. Not with our neighbor country. But the truth is that China believes given these differences, we should be able to cooperate and pursue win-win cooperation. And when it comes to differences, we should try to resolve them in a peaceful manner through negotiation, diplomacy. I think that's a great example that, for international relations.
So, Eugene, in light of this 80th anniversary of the victory in the anti-fascist war, how can China and Russia work together to defend the legacy and oppose efforts to, as other guests mentioned, whitewash fascism and militarism, and also promote this multilateralism and global security?
Well, honestly, there is very little you can do. So what Angelo mentioned before, he said pragmatic a couple of times, characterizing Russia, China, and some other countries. So here we have like this debate going on between realism and values-driven approach going on, and realism is becoming very popular now, even in the West, among many people who are somewhat skeptical about what's going on in the world. And I do believe that realism and pragmatism is a much better foundation for multilateral, peaceful, win-win cooperation globally in the world in a more democratic fashion. At the same time, when you understand that certain things might be dangerous, so you just you try to understand your partner, you try to be in their shoes, what they might do, how they might react to this or that action. So this is definitely a much better framework to work with. But on the other hand, there is one major weakness with realism and realist-based approach, is it ignores a lot of things that are irrational the human factor, and that in fact, you, for example, may build a very good economic relationship with a country or with the region, for example, and you believe, well, they have so much to lose if they break this relationship, if they sacrifice this economic ties that we have built, for example, but they will still do that. You know, if there is an irrational motivation, they will do that, even if it doesn't benefit them, even if it is gonna hurt them a lot, they will still do that. And there's a lot of room for manipulation over there. One of the things we're talking today, and something that Angelo also mentioned before, and probably Dr. Chen also, is that there's so much relationship between this history of Nazism in Europe, for example, and modern day European Union, maybe. So how is it intertwined? I think the explanation is very simple, is that behind every major Western European-based ideology, a framework of thinking, international order, there is one very simple idea, and it is the idea of superiority. And it is actually a thing for every culture and every civilization on the planet in every part of history, but here it's been perfected, really. And so behind the Nazism or behind the liberalism, there is the same idea that we are the best. It might be based on your, I don't know, on how you look, or it may be based on what values we have, but it is very difficult to convince people that they should not consider themselves superior. So that they should not maybe revisit their history and return to greatness. So how do you do that? There is very little you can do when people are going to shoot themselves in the foot. But what you can do, I think, is that, and returning back to President Xi's visit to Moscow, is that you can hold to your own. You can maintain understanding. You can oppose rewriting history, at least within your own country. And why so many people have been paying attention to what leaders are coming to Moscow for May 9th, is that these are the leaders that show to the world that they have a somewhat independent stance.
Angelo, so in your view, what lessons can the international community learn from the experience of the Second World War to, better safeguard today's peace and stability?
Well, it is hard to say, especially when you have this whitewashing, you have the rewriting of history. And also keep in mind that most people in the West, sadly, when you talk about average Joe, he will tell you, whatever he would tell you is actually learned not from history books, but from Netflix and Hollywood. And there's also, as Eugene just mentioned before, there's an emotional factor there. People are extremely manipulated through emotions. And that's what Hollywood does. That's what those news media do 24 hours a day. And this is why when you look at the policies of Russia, both Russia and China, they have been relaxing the visa procedure just to visit their countries. And by doing so, you can imagine someone who's been brainwashed his whole life by Hollywood, all those billions of dollars spent by the US State Department into demonizing China. Well, those people, everything they know about China is all grim, it's all negative. Well, 24 hours for those people, the first 24 hours going to Shanghai, for example, they would land into Pudong Airport, extremely modern airport. They would take the train, the fast train, the fastest they've ever seen. They would arrive in Pudong and they would see a city bustling, extremely modern, people being happy. Then they spend the evening, in a busy street and just realizing that how similar we are. And the same I would say for Russia. There is a few people, YouTubers and personalities like Tucker Carlson. He went to Russia, to Moscow, and he went into a grocery store and he started comparing the prices. And he started realizing, oh, well, the metro here in Moscow is extremely clean, very modern. People are nice to me and so on. And this is a wow moment. It's a wow moment. And this is why somehow you have some elites in the West, they want to actually build those walls because those are inconvenient truths. You see, when you go to both Moscow and Beijing and Shanghai, well, you won't see extreme poverty, people living in the street. You won't see that. It's extremely marginal. And you would just realize, well, maybe we have a problem. And I would say fight ignorance, because the stage average Joe, and this is on purpose. I'm not blaming average Joe in the West. This is intense propaganda. But I would say most of people in the West are at the first stage, the lowest level of awareness, which is they don't know that they don't know. And I would say the first stage of wisdom is that when you realize you know that you don't know, and then you start actually being curious and you start being humble. And I'm coming from my personal experience. I actually really thought on my 30 years ago when I came to China, I really thought that in the West we had a better society. And slowly, 30 years later, coming from my own experience, I feel extremely humble right now.
So lastly, Mr. Chen, so looking ahead, how do you see China's role evolving in shaping the future of global peace, stability, and cooperation in the years to come?
Well, I would first say I agree with what Angelo said. I mean, completely. I think the Western propaganda against China, I mean, against Russia too. I mean, it's just totally absurd. But it's very successfully brainwashed a lot of their citizens. I mean, that's sad. Though hopefully more people in the West, in Europe, in America would go to China, see for themselves. And, I am not saying China is a paradise. There is nothing to improve. I mean, China has been an evolving story, has been learning, improving over the past decades. Everybody witnessed China, knows that very well. They try to portray China as a sort of try to topple the international system. But obviously, with what the US has been doing for just these past 100 days, people know who is actually trying to undermine the global system. It's not China. And China, like most, say, country in the global south, obviously want to improve the global system, because they're not very well reflected. As others mentioned, for example, World Bank, the IMF, China, India, the developing country obviously should play a bigger role. The BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, others, the G20 even, could play a much better role, in complementing the global system. The U.S. administration, especially even with just looking the last few years, the Biden administration, they try to lead the world into a new Cold War, dividing the world, and they've been making provocations even against China, multiple fronts. I mean, on the Taiwan question in South China Sea, China's East Asia. So I think they are obviously trying to lead the world into a new Cold War, if not another major world war, hot wars, a nuclear war even. That would be a disaster for the whole world. Europe suffered the most from the last Cold War. If you ask the Germans, I mean, it was country being divided into two. So I don't think Europeans want to go back to another Cold War, new Cold War. So we should join forces to resist this new Cold War effort and, sustain the global system.
With that, we're wrapping up this episode of the Media Chats. I've been speaking with Mr. Chen Weihua, EU Bureau Chief of China Daily, Eugen Pavlov, reporter with Sputnik News in Beijing, and Angelo Giuliano, a Swiss-Italian political analyst based in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.